Translation is the communication of the meaning of a source language text by means of an equivalent target language text, while interpreting, the facilitating of oral or sign language communication between users of different languages. Antedates writing. Translation began only after the appearance of written literature. There exist partial translations of the Sumerian Epic of Gilgamesh into Southwest Asian languages of the 2nd millennium BCE. Translators always risk inappropriate spillover of source language idiom and usage into the target language translation. On the other hand, spillovers have imported useful source language calques and loanwords that have enriched the target languages. Indeed, translators have helped substantially to shape the languages into which they have translated, owing to the demands of business documentation consequent to the Industrial Revolution that began in the mid-18th century. Some translation specialties have become formalized, with dedicated schools and professional associations. Because of the laboriousness of translation, since the 1940s engineers have sought to automate translation to mechanically aid the human translator. The rise of the Internet has fostered a worldwide market for translation services and has facilitated language localization. Translation studies systematically study the theory and practice of translation. Etymology. The English word translation derives from the Latin translatio. The modern Romance languages use equivalents of the English term translation that are derived from that same Latin source from the alternative, Latin traduco. The Slavic and Germanic languages likewise use calques of these Latin sources. The ancient Greek term for translation, mu epsilon tau alpha phi rho alpha sigma iota sigma, has supplied English with metaphrase, as contrasted with paraphrase. Metaphrase corresponds, in one of the more recent terminologies, to formal equivalence, and paraphrase to dynamic equivalence. Strictly speaking, the concept of metaphrase, or of word-for-word translation, is an imperfect concept, because a given word in a given language often carries more than one meaning, and because a similar given meaning may often be represented in a given language by more than one word. Nevertheless, metaphrase and paraphrase may be useful as ideal concepts that mark the extremes in the spectrum of possible approaches to translation. Theories. Western theory discussions of the theory and practice of translation reach back into antiquity and show remarkable continuities. The ancient Greeks distinguished between metaphrase and paraphrase. This distinction was adopted by English poet and translator John Dryden, who described translation as the judicious blending of these two modes of phrasing when selecting, in the target language, counterparts, or equivalents, for the expressions used in the source language. When appear literally graceful, it were an injury to the author that they should be changed. But since what is beautiful in one is often barbarous, nay sometimes nonsense, in another, it would be unreasonable to limit a translator to the narrow compass of his author's words. 'Tis enough if he choose out some expression which does not vitiate the sense. Dryden cautioned, however, against the license of imitation, i.e. of adapted translation. When a painter copies from the life, he has no privilege to alter features and lineaments. This general formulation of the central concept of translation, equivalence, is as adequate as any that has been proposed since Cicero and Horace, who, in 1st century BCE Rome, famously and literally cautioned against translating word for word. Despite occasional theoretical diversity, the actual practice of translation has hardly changed since antiquity, except for some extreme metaphrases in the early Christian period and the Middle Ages, and adapters in various periods. Translators have generally shown prudent flexibility in seeking equivalence, literal where possible, paraphrastic where necessary, for the original meaning and other crucial values as determined examined from context. In general, translators have sought to preserve the context itself by reproducing the original order of sememes, and hence word order, when necessary, reinterpreting the actual grammatical structure, for example, by shifting from active to passive voice, or vice versa. The grammatical differences between fixed word order languages and free word order languages have been no impediment in this regard. The particular syntax characteristics of a text-sourced language are adjusted to the syntactic requirements of the target language. When a target language has lacked terms that are found in a source language, translators have borrowed those terms, thereby enriching the target language, thanks in great measure to the exchange of calques and loanwords between languages, and to their importation from other languages. There are few concepts that are untranslatable among the modern European languages. Generally, the greater the contact and exchange that have existed between two languages, or between those languages and a third one, the greater is the ratio of metaphrase to paraphrase that may be used in translating among them. However, due to shifts in ecological niches of words, a common etymology is sometimes misleading as a guide to current meaning in one or the other language. For example, the English actual should not be confused with the cognate French actual, the Polish aktualny, the Swedish actual, the Russian of the Dutch aktual. The translator's role as a bridge for carrying across values between cultures has been discussed at least since Terence, the 2nd century BCE Roman adapter of Greek comedies. The translator's role is, however, by no means a passive mechanical one, and so has also been compared to that of an artist. The main ground seems to be the concept of parallel creation found in critics such as Cicero. Dryden observed that translation is a type of drawing after life. Comparison of the translator with a musician or actor goes back at least to Samuel Johnson's remark about Alexander Pope playing Homer on a flageolet, while Homer himself used the bassoon. If translation be an art, it is no easy one. In the 13th century, Roger Bacon wrote that if a translation is to be true, the translator must know both languages, as well as the science that he is to translate, and finding that few translators did, he wanted to do away with translation and translators altogether. The translator of the Bible into German, Martin Luther, is credited with being the first European to posit that one translates satisfactorily only toward his own language. L. G. Kelly states that since Johann Gottfried Herder in the 18th century, it has been axiomatic that one translates only toward his own language. Compounding that demands on the translator is the fact that no dictionary or thesaurus can ever be a fully adequate guide in translating. The Scottish historian Alexander Tytler, in his essay on the principles of translation, emphasized that assiduous reading is a more comprehensive guide to a language than dictionaries. The same point, but also including listening to the spoken language, had earlier, in 1783, been made by the Polish poet and grammarian Onufry Andrzej Kopczynski. The translator's special role in society is described in a posthumous 1803 essay by Poland's La Fontaine, the Roman Catholic primate of Poland. Poet, encyclopedist, author of the first Polish novel, and translator from French and Greek, Ignacy Krasicki. Other traditions. Due to Western colonialism and cultural dominance in recent centuries, Western translation traditions have largely replaced other traditions. The Western traditions draw on both ancient and medieval traditions, and on more recent European innovations. Though earlier approaches to translation are less commonly used today, they retain importance when dealing with the products, as when historians view ancient or medieval records to piece together events which took place in non-Western or pre-Western environments. Also, though heavily influenced by Western traditions and practiced by translators taught in Western-style educational systems, Chinese and related translation traditions retain some theories and philosophies unique to the Chinese tradition. Near East, the traditions of translating material among Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Syriac, Anatolian and Hebrew go back several millennia. An early example of a bilingual document is the 1274 BCE Treaty of Kadesh. Asia. There is a separate tradition of translation in South, Southeast and East Asia, especially connected with the rendering of religious, particularly Buddhist, texts and with the governance of the Chinese Empire. Classical Indian translation is characterized by loose adaptation, rather than the closer translation more commonly found in Europe, and Chinese translation theory identifies various criteria and limitations in translation. In the East Asian sphere of Chinese cultural influence, more important than translation per se has been the use and reading of Chinese texts, which also had substantial influence on the Japanese, Korean and Vietnamese languages, with substantial borrowings of vocabulary and writing system. Notable is the Japanese Kanban, a system for glossing Chinese texts for Japanese speakers, though Indianized states in Southeast Asia often translated Sanskrit material into the local languages. The literate elites and scribes more commonly used Sanskrit as the primary language of culture and government. Islamic world translation of material into Arabic expanded after the creation of Arabic script in the 5th century, and gained great importance with the rise of Islam and Islamic empires. Arab translation initially focused primarily on politics, rendering Persian, Greek, even Chinese and Indic diplomatic materials into Arabic. It later focused on translating classical Greek and Persian works, as well as some Chinese and Indian texts, into Arabic for scholarly study at major Islamic learning centers, such as the Al-Qara'an, Al-Azhar, and the Al-Nizamiyya of Baghdad. In terms of theory, Arabic translation drew heavily on earlier Near Eastern traditions as well as more contemporary Greek and Persian traditions. Arabic translation efforts and techniques are important to Western translation traditions due to centuries of close contacts and exchanges. Especially after the Renaissance, Europeans began more intensive study of Arabic and Persian translations of classical works as well as scientific and philosophical works of Arab and Oriental origins. Arabic and, to a lesser degree, Persian became important sources of material and perhaps of techniques for revitalized Western traditions, which in time would overtake the Islamic and Oriental traditions. In the 19th century, after the Middle East's Islamic clerics and copyists had conceded defeat in the centuries-old battle to contain the corrupting effects of the printing press, explosion in publishing ensued. Along with expanding secular education, printing transformed an overwhelmingly illiterate society into a partly literate one. In the past, the sheikhs and the government had exercised a monopoly over knowledge. Now an expanding elite benefited from a stream of information on virtually anything that interested them. Between 1880 and 1908, more than 600 newspapers and periodicals were founded in Egypt alone. The most prominent among them was Al-Muqtata, was the popular expression of a translation movement that had begun earlier in the century with military and medical manuals and highlights from the Enlightenment canon. The movement to translate English and European texts transformed the Arabic and Ottoman Turkish languages, and new words, simplified syntax, and directness came to be valued over the previous convolutions. Educated Arabs and Turks in the new professions and the modernized civil service expressed skepticism, writes Christopher de Bellai, with a freedom that is rarely witnessed today. No longer was legitimate knowledge defined by texts in the religious schools, interpreted for the most part with stultifying literalness. It had come to include virtually any intellectual production anywhere in the world. One of the neologisms that, in a way, came to characterize the infusion of new ideas via translation was Darwinia, or Darwinism. One of the most influential liberal Islamic thinkers of the time was Muhammad Abduh, Egypt's senior judicial authority, its chief mufti, at the turn of the 20th century and an admirer of Darwin who in 1903 visited Darwin's exponent, Herbert Spencer, at his home in Brighton. Spencer's view of society as an organism with its own laws of evolution paralleled Abduh's ideas. After World War I, when Britain and France divided up the Middle East's countries, apart from Turkey, between them, pursuant to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in violation of solemn wartime promises of post-war Arab autonomy, there came an immediate reaction. The Muslim Brotherhood emerged in Egypt, the House of Saud took over the Hijaz, and regimes led by army officers came to power in Iran and Turkey. Author liberal currents of the modern Middle East, writes de Belaïn, Islamism and militarism, received a major impetus from Western empire builders. As often happens in countries undergoing social crisis, the aspirations of the Muslim world's translators and modernizers, such as Muhammad Abduh, largely had to yield to retrograde currents. Fidelity and transparency. Fidelity and transparency, dual ideals in translation, are often at odds. A 17th-century French critic coined the phrase les belles infidèles to suggest that translations, like women, can be either faithful or beautiful, but not both. Faithfulness is the extent to which a translation accurately renders the meaning of the source text, without distortion. Transparency is the extent to which a translation appears to a native speaker of the target language to have originally been written in that language, and conforms to its grammar, syntax and idiom. A translation that meets the first criterion is said to be faithful, a translation that meets the second, idiomatic. The two qualities are not necessarily mutually exclusive. The criteria for judging the fidelity of a translation vary according to the subject, type and use of the text, its literary qualities, its social or historical context, etc. The criteria for judging the transparency of a translation appear more straightforward. An unidiomatic translation sounds wrong, and, in the extreme case of word-for-word translations generated by many machine translation systems, often results in patent nonsense. Nevertheless, in certain contexts a translator may consciously seek to produce a literal translation. Translators of literary, religious or historic texts often adhere as closely as possible to the source text, stretching the limits of the target language to produce an unidiomatic text. A translator may adopt expressions from the source language in order to provide local color. In recent decades, prominent advocates of such non-transparent translation have included the French scholar Antoine Berman, who identified 12 deforming tendencies inherent in most prose translations, and the American theorist Lawrence Venuti, who has called on translators to apply foreignizing rather than domesticating translation strategies. Berman further insists on the need for a translation project to perform translation criticism afterwards. Many non-transparent translation theories draw on concepts from German Romanticism, the most obvious influence being the German theologian and philosopher Friedrich Schleiermacher. In his seminal lecture on the different methods of translation, he distinguished between translation methods that move the writer toward i.e., transparency, and those that move the reader toward i.e., An extreme fidelity to the foreignness of the source text. Schleiermacher favored the latter approach. He was motivated, however, not so much by a desire to embrace the foreign, as by a nationalist desire to oppose France's cultural domination and to promote German literature. Current Western translation practice is dominated by the dual concepts of fidelity and transparency. This has not always been the case, however. There have been periods, especially in pre-classical Rome and in the 18th century, when many translators stepped beyond the bounds of translation proper into the realm of adaptation. Adapted translation retains currency in some non-Western traditions. The Indian epic, the Ramayana, appears in many versions in the various Indian languages, and the stories are different in each. Similar examples are to be found in medieval Christian literature, which adjusted the text to local customs and mores. Equivalence. The question of fidelity versus transparency has also been formulated in terms of, respectively, formal equivalence and dynamic equivalence. The latter expressions are associated with the translator Eugene Nida and were originally coined to describe ways of translating the Bible, but the two approaches are applicable to any translation. Formal equivalence corresponds to metaphrase, and dynamic equivalence to paraphrase. Dynamic equivalence conveys the essential thoughts expressed in a source text, if necessary, at the expense of literality. Original semi-man word order, the source text's active versus passive voice, etc. By contrast, formal equivalence attempts to render the text literally or word for word, if necessary, at the expense of features natural to the target language. There is, however, no sharp boundary between functional and formal equivalence. On the contrary, they represent a spectrum of translation approaches. Each is used at various times and in various contexts by the same translator, and at various points within the same text, sometimes simultaneously. Competent translation entails the judicious blending of functional and formal equivalence. Common pitfalls in translation, especially when practiced by inexperienced translators, involve false equivalents such as false friends and false cognates. Back translation. A back translation is a translation of a translated text back into the language of the original text, made without reference to the original text. Comparison of a back translation with the original text is sometimes used as a check on the accuracy of the original translation, much as the accuracy of a mathematical operation is sometimes checked by reversing the operation. But the results of such reverse translation operations, while useful as approximate checks, are not always precisely reliable. Back translation must in general be less accurate than back calculation because linguistic symbols are often ambiguous, whereas mathematical symbols are intentionally unequivocal. In the context of machine translation, a back translation is also called a round-trip translation, when translations are produced of material used in medical clinical trials, such as informed consent forms. A back translation is often required by the Ethics Committee or Institutional Review Board. Mark Twain provided humorously telling evidence for the frequent unreliability of back translation when he issued his own back translation of a French translation of his short story, The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. He published his back translation in a 1903 volume together with his English-language original, the French translation, and a private history of the Jumping Frog story. The latter included a synopsized adaptation of his story that Twain stated had appeared, unattributed to Twain, in a Professor Sidgwick's Greek prose composition under the title, The Athenian and the Frog. The adaptation had for a time been taken for an independent ancient Greek precursor to Twain's Jumping Frog story. When a historic document survives only in translation, the original having been lost, researchers sometimes sometimes undertake back translation in an effort to reconstruct the original text. An example involves the novel The Saragossa Manuscript by the Polish aristocrat Jan Potocki, who wrote the novel in French and anonymously published fragments in 1804 and 1813–14. Portions of the original French-language manuscript were subsequently lost, however. The missing fragments survived in a Polish translation that was made by Edmund Chojecki in 1847 from a complete French copy, now lost. French-language versions of the complete Saragossa manuscript have since been produced, based on extant French-language fragments and on French-language versions that have been back-translated from Chojecki's Polish version. Similarly, when historians suspect that a document is actually a translation from another language, back-translation into that hypothetical original language can provide supporting evidence by showing that such characteristics as idioms, puns, peculiar grammatical structures, etc., are in fact derived from the original language. For example, the known text of the Till Eulenspiegel folk tales is in High German but contains puns that work only when back-translated to Low German. This seems clear evidence that these tales were originally written in Low German and translated into High German by an over-metaphrastic translator. Similarly, supporters of Aramaic primacy have the view that the Christian New Testament or its sources were originally written in the Aramaic language. Seek to prove the case by showing that difficult passages in the existing Greek text of the New Testament make much better sense when back-translated to Aramaic, that, for example, some incomprehensible references are in fact Aramaic puns that do not work in Greek. Due to similar indications, it is believed that the 2nd century Gnostic Gospel of Judas, which survives only in Coptic, was originally written in Greek.